Welcome to Trinidad and Tobago. We continue to follow the developments in the Cedros area, particularly the Southwest Peninsula. A video of 11 persons rushing ashore has now raised a number of questions about human rights violations. And the Hugh Law School, as well as the Law Faculty of Trinidad and Tobago that's attached to the University of the West Indies, they've all been having conversations about our obligation, our humanitarian obligation, but also our human rights conventions. Well, Jason and the rest of his team, they've had a number of clinics over the last day speaking on this matter, and here he is on the Morning Brew today to tell us a little bit about what's right, what's wrong, and what's not being done. Good morning, Jason. How are you?
Good morning, Hema. Thank you for having us.
Now, my first question, Jason, in terms of the humanitarian laws, do we have any obligations to the persons that land in this country?
Yes, we do. While those persons may not necessarily immediately fall into the definition of a refugee, there was a guidance note that was issued by the UNHCR earlier this year regarding the outflow of Venezuelans generally, and it applies to all the countries in the region neighboring the state of Venezuela. The guidance note is based on the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, which guarantees certain rights to persons who are vulnerable and who are in need of protection. So yes, we really should offer some sort of assistance to such persons.
Now, do we know when these persons come here, if they are detained? Once they land on our shores, are they afforded any rights at all?
Well, it's a very gray area in terms of detention.
Right.
Because detention, by its very nature, is a very draconian measure. It's a measure that is a deprivation of someone's right to liberty. What rights does someone have when they land ashore? Well, according to our Immigration Act, a person may be released on what's called an order of supervision, on that's Section 17 of the Immigration Act. So really, you don't want to go the draconian route of detention for a breach such as illegal entry by a port not recognized. What you really should have is an alternative to detention, the order of supervision, for example. Maybe having them relinquish their passports or other immigration documents if they're deemed as a flight risk. But I think it's proven that detention generally costs more to states than having these persons pay their own way, pay their own rent, etc.
We continue to ignore this problem.
Yes.
What is going to be the fallout? Because you see situations of women, children, and one counselor claiming the majority of them end up in the sex trade, particularly those who enter illegally.
That is correct. And I think what is very disturbing here is when I looked at the reports over the weekend, we saw that there were nationalities from Venezuela, but also Guyana. There were some people from Syria. There were children. There were women. And certainly it seems as though there is some element of trafficking or smuggling going on. And but we talk about refugees, we talk about illegal immigrants, but we're not really hearing the conversation about trafficking, human smuggling or human trafficking and the consequences of that.
Do we know the extent of it in our country?
I don't think we do know the extent of it in our country. I think the focus has been so much on illegals, and the language of the reports has been, these illegal persons are going to be deported or detained, but we're not hearing about the smuggling, we're not hearing about the trafficking. And I think those are elements that really need to explode and be brought to the fore as well. You
have done a lot of work in regard to this area. Have you received any evidence at all that human trafficking is happening?
The issue is, according to our Trafficking in Persons Act, human trafficking is defined as persons who are brought here for exploitation. Now, the definition of exploitation is very ambiguous. Certainly, there seems to be smuggling, and smuggling could be distinguished from trafficking. But there is certainly, we know that when Venezuelans or other immigrants land in Trinidad and Tobago, they may very well be exploited. And we have had cases where we see exploitation occurring. There was a viral video over the weekend of someone who was abused. So we know that exploitation is taking place.
So it's a poorly drafted law that we can't address the human rights issue on this?
I don't think that is a poorly drafted law. Certainly we do need legislation in conformity with the international obligations and treaty obligations that we have. And I know that there's a national draft policy, but I think it's really the interpretation of the Immigration Act. We probably need to have more sensitivity and more training to our judicial officers, to the police service. There was a 2017 decision of Justice Kokoram which spoke about the issue of detention at length with a Nigerian national who was detained in Trinidad and Tobago, and it was deemed that his period of detention was draconian and inhumane.
So how do we even, what would you suggest? How do we even begin to deal with this conversation?
I think that we need to accept the reality as this is happening, and we need to not bury our heads in the sand. It seems that many persons are burying their heads in the sand. We need to deploy resources to deal with this. We can give jobs, etc., to our own citizens to assist in this problem. Interpreters is always a problem when you are at the immigration center for special inquiries, etc., or even when the immigrants come before the courts for illegal entry. There always seems to be a problem with accessing interpreters. This is an area we have very young, bright graduates graduating from our institutions in languages. We can employ them, bring them into the system, develop some sort of system in place for dealing with this problem, because it's not going to go away.
Now, you know, the situation with these immigrants, we still don't know what is going to happen to them. So when they land here, what happens to them? And they're detained or they're found. They've had 2 raids in South.
Yes.
They've held about 20 persons. So what is going to happen to them?
What is supposed to happen is that, according to the Immigration Act, a special inquiry is supposed to be convened to determine whether they have in fact breached the Act. If they have breached the Act, then an order for deportation can be made and they can be sent back. The question, though, in the gray area is what our obligations to such persons. We know that the obligations to asylum seekers, to persons who meet the definition of refugees according to the convention, those are persons who are persecuted, who cannot go back because they have a real founded fear that their life is in danger. They certainly are afforded more protection, or should be afforded more protection. But economic migrants, people who just come in search of a better life, not necessarily because of political persecution, they do not enjoy the same rights. However, we cannot bury our heads that there is a crisis in Venezuela, and we really should follow the guidance notes of the UNHCR. And it's looking at things like having families kept together, etc., and exploring all these alternatives to detention rather than the measure of detention.
Because do you think the population even cares about what's happening?
I think that there are segments of the population that do care about what's happening.
We've had an influx and inflow of Venezuelan nationals for the last 2 to 3 years, and no one seems to even be concerned that this is happening, that women are being forced into sex rings. There was this video of a woman brutally beaten, humiliated, and posted online when she attempted to end a relationship. When I spoke with Yasina Gonzalez, she said that is not unusual. Yes,
and that's why the work of human rights attorneys and the law school, for example, and its advocacy and education is important to sensitize the public. There are groups like the Living Water Community that do human service in terms of refugees, and those groups continue to they need our assistance.
What's happening with the refugee law and the immigration law in this country?
As far as I know right now, that there is a draft policy.
There has been a draft policy for the last 2 years, I think.
Yes, there has been a draft policy for the past 2 years, but I know that there was a joint select committee at Parliament earlier this year, where they have been looking at those issues. There are supposed to be some guidelines that are in place, and I haven't seen the guidelines, so I can't comment on it. But I do believe that we are making some progress. Slowly, but it's getting there.
You know, we talk about the conversation of human trafficking. There's a counter-trafficking unit. Yes. So I feel sometimes that we have a tick box, that we've have all the boxes ticked, because we've passed the legislation. But there have been only 13 people that are before the courts that have been charged or linked to human trafficking. And considering the horror stories that I have heard myself, I don't know whether we're incapable of it or if we're exaggerating a problem that doesn't exist.
I think we need to, all the departments need to work in tandem, because we seem to look at the refugee or the migrants issue in isolation, and we don't link it to the human trafficking issue. There needs to be linkage made.
Jason, your closing comments. How do we then move forward from here? Because there's a video that sparked outcry, but when I spoke with the councillor yesterday, he says this is not unusual.
It's not unusual. I think that we need to approach the situation with compassion from a human rights perspective, realize that these people are not coming here voluntarily. They're not looking to be a drain on our resources. they are looking for a better life. They're coming in search of work. They're coming in search of some sort of or persecution. They have been persecuted in their own country, and they're coming to escape persecution. We need to approach the situation with compassion, and we need to lobby our representatives to treat the situation as such.
Their closing comments there. Jason, thanks so much for taking the time to share your views with us this morning.